Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Adam Lang. The Australian economy grew by just 0.2% in the June quarter and 1% annually. It's the slowest rate of growth since the 1990s, excluding the COVID-19 pandemic, and a large chunk of it comes back to households tightening their belts, with discretionary spending down 1.1% for the quarter. I'm delighted to say that Jo Masters is with us. She is the Chief Economist at Barrenjoey. Jo, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Great to be talking to you.
Thank you for joining us in such a busy time of year. So what did you make of the Australian National Accounts headline numbers released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics yesterday? Were you surprised?
We weren't surprised, Adam. Look, as you said, the headline number is very, very weak, but it was in line with market expectations. Now, to be fair, when we get into the detail, and I know most people think about economic growth, but the national accounts are a very rich source of information about the economy. We do see more evidence that the private domestic part of the economy is incredibly weak. So really it's been exports and also government spending. And when we look at private domestic economy, it actually contracted in the quarter. So that bit is a bit weaker than economists have been looking for.
Let's get into the detail and the individual components, Jo, because as you point out, that's so important. It's not just one average story. There's lots of parts of this. Was one of the biggest hits to growth a drop in household spending?
Drops in household spending are actually quite rare. That was unanticipated. We're not surprised that it's the household sector that's suffering, but to get a contraction in the quarter was certainly outside of expectations. So to put that into perspective, outside of the global financial crisis and the pandemic, this is only the fourth time we've had a quarterly contraction since that deep recession that we saw in the 1990s. And when you think about that in the context of population growth that's running in the high 2%, that's an incredibly weak outlook and outcome for the biggest part of our economy. Remember, household spending is about 55% of total economic activity in the economy.
And as you say, that per capita number, that would look even worse.
Absolutely. Now, it's looked weak for some time. We are in a deep per capita recession. We're now 2% below the peak that we had in per capita GDP, and also in the longest consecutive contraction on record. Now, sometimes investors will say, why do we care about per capita GDP? Surely we just care about all economic activity. But this reason is that people feel the economy on a per capita basis. And it's also links into that concept of unemployment, which is also a per capita concept. So this is telling us that without population growth and without public spending, this economy would be in a deep recession.
Wow. So let's have a look at households and savings. It looks like those numbers are really soft. How are you seeing those?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've seen over the last 18 months, I suppose, and certainly in the last year, was that household consumption stayed more resilient than we'd expected. And we're seeing something similar in other economies like the US. When we look at Australia, it was really buffered from high interest rates by two things. The first one was savings. So lots of households built up their savings during the pandemic when we supported income and you couldn't go out and spend. And slowly we've been winding that down. But the other one was really around the strength of the labour market, not just employment or a low number of people that were unemployed, but the number of hours being worked was also boosting income. Now, both of those things are effectively coming to an end. And as a result, households are really starting to pull in any discretionary spending. And within that discretionary component, we could see it across quite a broad range of goods and services. But the other interesting one, and I think this is my favorite fun fact of the national accounts that we've had this week, is that we're eating less, as in volume, which I find quite interesting.
Is that per capita or overall?
No, that's it's overall. So overall, the volume of food consumed either from supermarkets or from cafes and restaurants has contracted in the quarter. Now, I find that quite surprising because that's essential, right? So perhaps some households are cutting back on some of those discretionary snacks, if you like, but also perhaps trading down into lower value things at the supermarket. So that is a real sign that households are pulling in on the budget.
Jo, you mentioned we're tightening our belts before, and I took that as a metaphor, but perhaps you mean literally.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So government spending, you touched on that before. How does that play into this result?
Yeah, so we did see quite material contribution from government spending, and that's government investment, but also what we call consumption. So that's the provision of goods and services. And we saw it across state governments and federal governments. So to put that in perspective, the public sector contributed 0.3 percentage points to growth in the quarter. And as you said in your intro, we only got 0.2% growth. So
Wow.
basically, if you take out the public sector, the economy contracted in the quarter. And there's a variety of ways we can cut that, but there's no doubt the public sector has been really important.
Stay with me, Joe. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Barrenjoey Chief Economist Joe Masters. So let's have a look at home building, which seems to have slumped 3% over the last year. This tends to have a flow-on effect because it's not just the construction and materials that matter, it's also the new purchases that we might need to fill a new home. How are you seeing the home building numbers?
So, as you said, we have seen a contraction. That's not a surprise. We've known that that's been coming for some time. Partly because if you think about what HomeBuilder was designed to do during the pandemic, it was designed to bring forward building activity. So when you bring forward building activity, you often end up with a hole at the other end. We've also see in the construction space still a lot of elevated pressure around the cost of some inputs, mostly those that come at the later stage of construction, but also labour. And so that's sort of slowing down the ability to complete some of these residential construction activity. Now, we also know from building approvals that not much is getting approved. So this contraction in resi construction is really only at the beginning of what's likely to be a multi-quarter long contraction there. I just note that building approvals per 1,000 people in the economy is at record lows. So not a surprise there, but one, as you said, that does flow through. The construction sector is a big employer, for example. So that is adding to weakness, but probably wasn't a surprise on the day.
Wow, so you can see this continuing for some time now. We know that Michelle Bullock is due to give a couple of speeches today. Got the Reserve Bank due to meet later this month. What do you think the Reserve Bank will make of these figures?
Yeah, so I think a lot of investors, and particularly perhaps offshore investors, will be looking at this GDP data and thinking that perhaps a rate cut this year is now a possibility or on the cards. But I expect Governor Bullock later today, when she talks at the ANICA lunch, to actually sound quite hawkish still. The title of her speech is The Cost of High Inflation. So I think we need to remember that whilst these growth numbers are turning over, inflation has made very little progress in the last 6 months. And the unemployment rate, whilst it's risen, it's been quite orderly and is still below full employment, or the RBA's estimate of full employment. So I think she'll still talk about inflation being too high, and how do we address that? Well, we need a better balance between aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the economy, or the output gap, if you like. And we think even after today's data, the RBA would still assess the economy to have a positive output gap. So we need more economic weakness. We need more weakness in the labour market. And that in time will bring inflation down and open the path to lower rates.
Gosh, it sounds like it's going to stay tough for a little while yet.
It's a very confronting story, particularly for those parts of the economy that are at the coalface of a slowing labour market or high interest rates. And of course, we've heard Governor Bullock and other RBA representatives acknowledge that. We know that monetary policy is a very, very blunt tool, and that's what's really playing out at the moment. But I suspect the message that the governor will give is that inflation hurts everyone. And of course, that's a message that we've heard from them before.
Yeah. So, Joe, this brings up the federal government's perspective in all of this, and it is perhaps 6 months till an election is on the cards. Will the federal government be under some pressure to help stimulate the economy? You know, how do they do that without adding to that inflation challenge? How are you seeing that?
It's a big debate. Now, I think we need to remember that in terms of monetary policy, we think about the aggregate. So it's not just federal governments, but state governments as well. And there's no doubt that state governments have been adding significantly to public demand. If we just look at the federal government, clearly they would prefer to have stronger polls. they've still got quite a bit of time before they need to go to an election. So there's a little bit of time before you start getting some of that electioneering. But they are adding to demand in the economy. I think an interesting aspect of this, though, when you think about the public debate that we've had, yes, they're adding to public demand, therefore inherently adding to inflation. But as we've discussed, if we took public spending out, this economy would be in a recession. And the Reserve Bank has taken quite a different path from other central banks, hasn't raised rates by as much, accepting that inflation will take longer to come back to target, but trying not to do too much damage to the labour market. And I think if we took out all government spending from the economy, we would be really in quite a deep recession. Inflation would come down faster, but at what cost? The cost of that would be higher unemployment.
Joe, these are confronting numbers, but I think as you've described it, they really do apply to how we all feel. And it's great to get your perspective and feel better informed about the situation we're in. So thank you for joining us to talk to Fear and Greed.
It's been my pleasure. And I'm sorry it's not a more upbeat message, but I think if we can get on top of this inflation story, hopefully in 2025, we're talking about cutting rates and easing some of that cost of living pressure for Australians.
Thank you, Joe. That was Joe Masters, Chief Economist at Barrenjoey. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Adam Lang. Enjoy your day.